Hello, everybody. My name is Jason Wolf, and in this video, I'm going to be reviewing this video here that you see before you, which is an interview that the notorious atheist New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman did on the channel Inspiring Philosophy, hosted by Michael Jones, which is ostensibly a Christian apologetics YouTube channel. And Michael Jones had Bart Ehrman on to interview him about the book of Revelation, because apparently Ehrman has recently written a book that seems to me as kind of like an atheist commentary on the book of Revelation, which is not out yet. Apparently, it'll still be another year for it to actually get published, because that is our normal publishing industry, apparently. And so he had him on to talk to him about the book of Revelation. And I found a lot in this video to disagree with. And so I'm going to watch through it here and comment on it as we go. And I've got it at a faster speed so that this doesn't take forever to watch. And so, yeah, let's get started.
And an individual. There are so many theories about the book of Revelation. Many think it's predicting the future. But what do scholars say about it? Dr. Bart Ehrman has a book coming out on Revelation. So I wanted to interview him because I worry a lot of the assumptions we have about it might be misguided. So I hope you learned something about Revelation from this interview. Enjoy. I'm really glad to have you here.
Okay, so you heard what he said there, that he introduced, okay, we got the book of Revelation. A lot of us have certain views of it, and you'll see in a second what he's referring to there, of the views that a lot of Christians have. And so, and you see him there posing the question, well, what do scholars say about it? And by scholars, apparently he means God-hating, Christ-rejecting atheist scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman, who have literally, for Ehrman, for example, who has literally spent his, devoted his career as a New Testament scholar to attacking the Bible and trying to undermine the faith of Christians. That apparently is the kind of scholar that Michael Jones thinks is somebody that Christians need to hear from to learn how to properly understand the book of Revelation. I mean, does anybody else see a problem with this? Is this not a little bit ridiculous? I mean, for example, just look at 1 Corinthians 2, where Paul explains that you have basically these two things. You have the worldly wisdom, the wisdom of this world, and then you have the spiritual truths that are revealed to us from God, which is the Bible would be an example of that. And that is not something you can understand through worldly wisdom. That is something that you understand through spiritual discernment. And so you cannot understand, if you're going to understand the Bible properly, especially a very, a book full of symbolism and references to the Old Testament, not necessarily lots of quotes from the Old Testament, but it's steeped in the Old Testament, referencing things and full of symbols and all this kind of stuff. To think that a book like that an avowed atheist is going to understand that book properly, and that we as Christians need to learn from him to understand this book, when this is a book that clearly requires a lot of spiritual discernment to properly understand, that is ridiculous. And to go to someone like, to just to set up this interview, not as, hey, I'm curious to see what a notorious skeptical scholar who's just written a book of Revelation, hey, I just wonder, how do skeptical scholars think about the book of Revelation? Because I know what Christians think about it, and you have a wide variety of different opinions from Christian scholars in the book of Revelation, but I wonder what skeptical scholars think, and which one, how many of their views would line up with the views of Christian scholars, but where do they depart and they believe completely different things from Christian scholars? Like, if that were the direction of this interview, I wouldn't even have a problem with it. But that's not that's not the way he frames his interview. He frames this as, hey, Christians, you think you understand Revelation, but you're wrong. You need to understand what the scholars think about this book, and the scholars here are represented by Bart Ehrman, the most notorious living atheist scholar. That is completely absurd. And then if you were to look at the thumbnail of this video, it shows Bart Ehrman. It says something like "The Secrets of Revelation Revealed." So that's the idea here. And then you see here the title to the video. You see it there at the bottom of the screen, says "The Book of Revelation Explained" with Dr. Bart Ehrman. So the whole setup here is that this God-hating, Christ-rejecting atheist scholar who's devoted his career to attacking the Bible, he is going to give us the truth about the book of Revelation. Folks, that is completely ridiculous and absurd. And it's especially absurd for this Christian apologist on his Christian apologetics, YouTube channel. This is his apologetics ministry, to invite on an atheist scholar and say he is going to reveal the secrets of the book of Revelation. He is basically the representative of all scholars. You're going to get the scholarly view of the book of Revelation. Folks, that is completely ridiculous. And so that's just as an intro here to this interview. Now they're going to spend a couple of minutes here talking about upcoming debate that Bart Ehrman has with Mike Licona about the resurrection. They're going to talk about that for a couple of minutes. So I'm just going to skip ahead here because I don't care. It's not relevant to the subject matter I want to discuss. So we're going to go see when they start talking about Revelation.
Because that is something that I've always been interested in. For one, I don't really think it's about the future, as a lot of Christians do. So can you talk about...
Okay, so he's talking about the book of Revelation. We're just going to go from here. He's talking about the book of Revelation, and you'll notice that statement that he just said right there. And I apologize for people that, I've got this video playing fast at 1.5 speed. That might be a little hard for people to follow. I listen to things at a faster speed a lot just to save time. A lot of people probably don't. So I apologize for that. But again, I don't want to be sitting here for hours responding to this video. So you notice right there, he said, he's talking about the book of Revelation, that he said that he doesn't think it's about the future the way most Christians do. Now, folks, you cannot just make a blanket statement like that about the book of Revelation, because everybody, I should say almost everybody, except for this little fringe group that I'm going to talk about here, believes that some aspect of the book of Revelation is about the future. Even the preterist, which is what Michael Jones is talking about here, is talking about preterism. This comes from the Latin meaning past, preter, and basically means pastism. So it is a view of prophecy that says biblical prophecy, most biblical prophecy, has been fulfilled in the past. But even preterists will believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ and the resurrection of everybody is still future, because Jesus Christ will come back bodily the same way he was here, obviously, as a physical person before, and the resurrection consists of actual bodies coming out of the ground, and obviously that did not happen in the past. And so there is a fringe group that would call themselves full preterists, that normal preterists would call hyper preterists. They believe that even that happened in the past, but it didn't literally happen, of Jesus coming back in a bodily visual manner with actual bodies coming out of their graves. They believe it was fulfilled in some spiritual sense. Now, taking what he said literally and at face value, which I know he cannot mean, because I don't think he's a full preterist, you would have to assume that Michael Jones is a full preterist, because he just said that he doesn't believe that the book of Revelation is about the future. Again, you cannot make a universal blanket statement like that, because you're basically saying, hey, everyone, I'm a full preterist. I don't think Jesus is coming back in the future because I think he already came back in the past. Again, I don't think that's what he actually believes, but by making a statement like that, a very sloppy, imprecise statement, he just described himself as a full preterist without realizing it, basically, is what I'm saying. And so but you see what his view is. He is giving the view that he thinks Revelation is a prophecy about the past, and that's what he wants to talk to Bart Ehrman about. And again, how's he framing this? He's framing this as, this is the scholarly view of Revelation, of basically as if there are no scholars that take a different view, as if just preterism just is the scholarly view, and now we have the most notorious atheist scholar here to explain this, to which we as Christians supposedly need him to explain this to us so we can understand the book of Revelation. So let's see what Bart Ehrman has to say.
A little bit of Revelation. First question I have is, wasn't this a book that was added late to the canon? It's something that wasn't included. It was kind of debated between Christians and whatnot. Can you talk about that a little bit and why you think it ended up in the canon?
Now, if you want, notice the transition of topics here. I'm sorry to be like nitpicky about this, but I don't even understand why he's bringing this up or even posing this question, because he just brought up, like, oh, I think Revelation is a prophecy about the past. I don't think it's about the future. And then immediately goes, oh, well, isn't this a book that was added late to the canon? What do you think about that? Now, technically speaking, I don't even see how Bart Ehrman could really have an opinion about which books of the Bible should be canonical versus not canonical, because to even have a concept of canonical books is to believe that there actually are such things as books that God inspired, right? That's what the canon is. We are saying, these are the books that are God-breathed. These are the books the holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Ghost. That's what it means to say that a book is canonical, that the book belongs in the Bible. And obviously, Bart Ehrman doesn't believe that's true about any book. So how could Bart Ehrman have an opinion about which books are canonical versus which books are not really canonical, when he, in his mind, the entire concept of a biblical canon, the entire concept of books inspired by God or not inspired by God is a meaningless concept. He cannot make a distinction. He does not see a distinction. I mean, imagine arguing with a Mormon where, as a Christian who does not believe the Book of Mormon is inspired by God at all, it wouldn't make any sense for me to say, oh, well, this book within the Book of Mormon, because the Book of Mormon, like the Bible, consists of different books. And imagine saying, well, this book, you guys shouldn't consider this canonical. This shouldn't be considered canonical. This shouldn't be in the Book of Mormon. I mean, why would I say that? That doesn't make any sense. I think the whole Book of Mormon is garbage. I'm not going to pick one book in particular and say, well, guys, why is this in the Book of Mormon? Why you shouldn't consider that book canonical. That doesn't make any sense, because I don't even have a concept of a Mormon book being canonical or not, because the whole thing is uninspired. So in the same way, Bart Ehrman can't really have an opinion about a book of the Bible being canonical or not. So in that sense, it doesn't even make sense to pose him this question. This is a nonsensical question for an atheist. And why would you even ask an atheist scholar about this? Again, it's one thing to understand or to be curious about, to want to inquire, hey, how does he read the Book of Revelation? What is his interpretation? And see the ways it's similar and different from the way Christians interpret it. But obviously, he is going to take this as an opportunity to attack the Book of Revelation and basically be like, oh yeah, this book shouldn't be in the Bible. Christians are stupid for thinking this book should be in the Bible. So Michael Jones knows he's setting him up to criticize the Book of Revelation. He brings him onto his supposedly Christian apologetics YouTube channel, asks him this softball question of, hey, tell my Christian audience why the Book of Revelation shouldn't even be in their Bibles. And then as we watch this, you'll see he doesn't even give any pushback or challenge anything that Bart Ehrman says. How is it a responsible thing for a Christian apologist to invite an atheist scholar on, give him these really easy setup questions where you know where he's going to go? You know he's going to argue that Revelation shouldn't even be canonical, and you're not even going to put up a fight at all. You're just going to go, hey, thousands of Christians, over 23,000 people that have watched this video, thousands and thousands of Christians watching this video, I'm setting this interview up as, we need to understand what the scholars say about Revelation. Here's our representative scholar, Bart Ehrman, and you immediately ask him to basically, please attack the canonicity of the Book of Revelation, and I'm not going to challenge anything you say. What in the world? And this is supposed to be an apologetics ministry? That doesn't make any sense. All right, let's see what Ehrman has to say.
Yeah, that's a topic I deal with in the book. I mean, the book started out being a book trying to show why it's not predicting our future and showing why. I'm not just saying it's not, it's actually showing why it's not. And talking about how that interpretation has led to a lot of problems over the years. It still does. But my last chapter of the book takes up this very question. Why did it have such trouble getting into the New Testament, and what happened, and all of that. So there were debates about it. The way it basically worked out was that in one part of the empire, in the western part of the empire, they thought that there were debates about it. In the eastern part, there were debates. So there was kind of a split on whether it ought to be in or not, along with other books, like the Apocalypse of Peter. Some people thought the Apocalypse of Peter should be in the New Testament rather than the Apocalypse of John. And Peter lost that debate, and John won it. So there were various reasons for doubting that it should be in the New Testament. One big one was that people didn't think that John, the disciple, wrote it, that it was written by a different John. And they thought that because they could read the Greek. When you read the Greek, whoever wrote the Book of Revelation did not write the Gospel of John. I mean, there was a 3rd century church father who demonstrated it, not the same guy. And the proofs that he came up with are ones that people still hold to today. The author of the Book of Revelation did not write Greek very well. There are grammatical mistakes. I mean, just flat out mistakes. Not very good.
There's mistakes in the Book of Revelation.
The message is valuable enough, but I'm just saying it's a different guy. So that was one. The other thing
yes,
is,
of course, I'm not going to challenge that.
For most people,
okay, let's pause the video here. I mean, he's just going on and on, talking to a Christian apologist who wanted to talk about this subject, but apparently can't be bothered to know the information. I'm not saying that he should debate him. I'm not saying, hey, and Michael Jones sort of tricked Bart Ehrman into coming onto his channel for an interview and then just debate him the whole time or something like that. Like, no, I understand that he's interviewing him and he's asking him questions, wants to let him talk, give him, let him express his point of view on the subject. No, I understand that, but, and again, he hasn't even really responded yet, but watch what he's going to do. He's not going to push, like, you can interview somebody. I'm not saying debate them. Give a real interview. But I mean, a lot of the interviews that I've watched that are I think the best kinds of interviews, or the best interviews to watch, are interviews where the interviewer is actually challenging the person, giving them pushback, because then you see like what that person's view is really made of, and you see how well that person can back up their position, what their actual arguments are, what their actual evidence is, and you learn a lot more from. I mean, if you're bringing him on to learn supposedly the secrets of Revelation, have him explain the book of Revelation, he's going to give you more details and bolster his arguments by giving him pushback. That is how, iron sharpens iron. That's what the Bible says. And so that is how you're going to actually get a better explanation of what his view is, by giving questions that challenge him and force him to defend his position, not to debate him, but just questions that challenge him. And so, for example, he is saying that, oh, well, we know from reading the Greek that the Apostle John didn't write the book of Revelation. Well, you could challenge. Well, can you give an example from the Greek of Revelation that is somehow the Apostle John could not have written that? Like, can you give an example of that? So, because he's just saying things, but I want to know what his actual evidence is. And you could bring up, for example, like, well, the biblical authors typically had other people. They were typically speaking what it is they wanted written down, and then other people wrote it out. So, for example, that is why Peter says, and of course, Ehrman doesn't even think this was actually Peter, but never mind that. Peter says that this is how Peter describes the Bible being inspired. He says, holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Ghost. Notice he doesn't say holy men of God wrote as they were moved by the Holy Ghost. He says holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Ghost, because much of the Bible is someone speaking the words of God and then someone else writing that down. And you can see that clearly, for example, if you just read Romans chapter 16, I forget which verse it's in, but you actually see this guy Tertius say, I, Tertius, who wrote you this letter, greet you, or something like that. And you might think to yourself, wait a minute, Tertius, who's Tertius? Paul wrote the book of Romans. Who's this Tertius guy? Well, that's a kind of secretary that is the person who actually physically wrote down what Paul said. And so Michael Jones could ask him, like, for example, in the book of Acts, it actually describes the Apostle John as being uneducated. And so Michael Jones, not debating him, just asking him questions to challenge him, to force him to provide actual evidence for the stuff he's saying, because he's not really giving evidence, he's just claiming things. And so remember, what does Matt Dillahunty say? Claims aren't evidence, or whatever. And so he's just claiming things. And so I want to know, what is the evidence behind these claims? And you would point out, hey, the Apostle John was uneducated. We know that people use basically like secretaries to write things down. Isn't it possible that the Apostle John had a secretary that he used to write his gospel and to write his epistles? And then when he's banished and imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos, he's on this prison island. And now he's writing out Greek himself by hand. He doesn't have a secretary. And because he's uneducated, he's not a scholar like the Apostle Paul. He's not this literary man. That's why you get this writing style and this Greek grammar is completely different from John's other writings. Isn't that a potential explanation? How do you argue against that? You could ask him that. Just ask him that. That's not debating. You're asking him a question like, doesn't that also explain the same evidence? So why is your explanation of that evidence better than what I just said? Right? And then he has to back up his claim, and then you're going to get better details of what his view actually is. But Michael Jones doesn't bother asking him anything. And Bart Ehrman also says, oh, well, there's this 3rd century guy. He proved it, and his arguments are still used. Okay, can you give an example of one of those arguments and explain to me why it is that argument supposedly proves this? Just give him just that little bit of pushback. Hey, can you show me some actual evidence? But Michael Jones can't be bothered to do any of this. He just sits there and smiles and laughs. The book of Revelation has mistakes in the Greek grammar. Oh, okay, ha 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 ha. Like, how are you a Christian apologist? And you're just going to sit there and grin and laugh and nod your head at Bart Ehrman, basically arguing that the Apocalypse of Peter is a better canonical book, supposedly, than the book of Revelation. So he's trying to sow doubts in the minds of Christians. Oh, we shouldn't have the book of Revelation in our Bibles. We should have the Apocalypse of Peter in our Bibles. That's what he wants Christians to think. And that the Apostle John didn't really write the book of Revelation. You invite him on, let him say all this stuff, give him no pushback whatsoever. Don't ask him any challenging questions. I'm not expecting him to debate him. I'm not expecting him to sit here and like refute Bart Ehrman or something. But at the very least, you can ask him questions that forces him to actually explain his position and give the actual evidence for his position, instead of just sitting there saying, yeah, we know it because he made grammatical mistakes. And this guy in the 3rd century, he proved it. I mean, he's not giving any actual evidence. He's just making statements, and Michael Jones can't bother to challenge any of those statements. And it's like, you're a Christian apologist, dude. How are you inviting this guy onto your channel, letting him say whatever he wants to attack the book of Revelation, and you're not going to challenge anything he says? I think that's completely irresponsible.
Ancient world was that it seemed to celebrate the glories of the life to come here on earth in these very materialistic kind of crass terms, that it's going to be like one big banquet after the other in a city of gold, and it's very materialistic. And it started getting into trouble when many Christians started adopting a very kind of strict lifestyle, where they thought if you're going to be deserving of God, you have to deny yourself in this life. And so you're not supposed to eat well, you're not supposed to drink a lot of wine, you're not supposed to have much sex, you got to preserve yourself for God. And here comes Revelation saying, oh yeah, city of gold, streets of gold, pearl, banquets. Oh my God, this is not what we think it's going to be like. And so that was the main reason. So until about the 5th century or so, it was not widely accepted. Starting in the late 4th, early 5th century, it started being accepted fairly widely.
Interesting. So why do you think, if you can comment on this or not, why do you think people today try to make this about the future? And what is the cultural context of Revelation really like?
Okay. So sorry to interrupt him again, but notice how Bart Ehrman sat there for several minutes, free reign, say whatever he wants. Oh yeah, here's why the book of Revelation, it's silly the Christians think it's canonical. The Apocalypse of Peter is a better book, and we know the Apostle John didn't write Revelations. He writes completely differently. He makes grammatical mistakes. All you have to do is read in the Greek. Everyone would realize he makes grammatical mistakes. It can't be the same person. And this guy from the 3rd century, he proved it. I'm not going to give you any actual arguments. I'm just going to say all these things. And like I said, it'd be very easy for Michael Jones to give gentle pushback kind of questions to challenge his view, force him to give what the actual evidence is, but Michael Jones can't be bothered to do any of that. It's just like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Yes, it's very interesting that you just attacked the book of Revelation and told my primarily Christian audience that it wasn't written by the Apostle John and shouldn't be in their Bibles. Oh, that's very interesting how you explain that. Well, anyway, let's talk about, why do people think it's a prophecy of the future? No challenging questions or pushback whatsoever. It's like, if he didn't want to talk about that and he just wants to talk about Ehrman's view on the actual prophecy, why didn't he make that the first question? Why did he sit there and give him the question of, hey, talk about how the book of Revelation got into the canon, talk about that? Why would you pose him this question that he's going to take as an opportunity to attack the authenticity of the book of Revelation if you have no follow-up questions to challenge what he's going to say, and you're going to go, okay, well, now let's talk about the prophecy. So you literally just invited him on to go, oh, please attack the book of Revelation. Please come onto my apologetics channel and attack the Bible for my audience. I don't know what to say, folks. Completely ridiculous.
That's like a two-part question here. Can you first talk about why you think people today sort of misunderstood that, even if we're just speculating, but what is the actual cultural context of the book of Revelation?
It is two things, but they're closely related, obviously. Today, there's been a tradition of reading Revelation as a prediction of our future only since the end of the 19th century. For most, there were occasionally people who thought it was predicting the future, but they were very occasionally. It kicked in big time in the 19th century. It actually started weirdly. This is something else I deal with in my book. People don't know this. It started with the French Revolution. And the reason it started with the French Revolution is you had these Brits who were scared to death, like something like that's going to happen in our country, and it's just chaos in France. And these were people who knew their Bible, and they said, "This is like it says in the Bible. There's all this craziness going on in Revelation. It's a fulfillment of Scripture." And they started thinking that we're near the end now. And that kind of simmered for a while through the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. Then toward the middle and end of the 19th century, this became a dominant reading of Revelation, and it coincided with the rise of Christian fundamentalism. The idea that the Bible is inerrant, there are no mistakes of any kind whatsoever, went closely hand in hand with the idea that Revelation is predicting our future.
I also just wanted to point out, since it just happened, and rewind it and watch it if you didn't notice this, but how Bart Ehrman is talking about inerrancy. It's like, oh yeah, this coincides with biblical inerrancy. There's no mistakes in the Bible. You can see Michael Jones like shaking his head, and he's shaking his head literally at the doctrine of inerrancy. He's literally sitting there shaking his head in shame and condemnation that Christians actually believe that God wrote a book, God breathed out a book for his people to have that doesn't contain mistakes and errors and whatever. He's literally shaking like, oh, biblical inerrancy, what a stupid idea. People actually think that the perfect being who created everything also revealed himself to us through his special revelation that's also perfect. It's just so silly. He's literally shaking his head in consternation at the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. I just wanted to point that out in passing, and we'll see what else Ehrman has to say here.
Most people today, at least in my part of the world, in the American South, most people, even if they're not Christian, they have a fundamentalist understanding of Christianity, where they think that if you don't believe the Bible's completely inerrant, you can't be a Christian. And fundamentalists think this, but so do the people who are not, because they think that fundamentalists have convinced them that's what it means to be a Christian. That is not what Christianity ever said until the end of the 19th century. And so it's a very bizarre view if you look at it historically, but it goes hand in hand. So I think what happens then is once you're convinced of something about the future, just anything that happens, oh my God, that was predicted in scripture.
Yeah.
World War II, Vietnam, and now, the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, just anything you say, yep, wars and rumors of wars, there it is. It's predicted right here. And so part of my book is looking at these predictions over the last 100 years or so, showing, they usually don't go well.
Exactly. So what is Revelation?
Okay. I want to comment on this before we move on to his next question. So you heard at the beginning of Bart Ehrman's little rambling there that he claims he said that people viewing the Book of Revelation as being about the future didn't come about until the 19th century. Then he immediately and wisely walked that back and said, well, there were occasionally people before that said that, but it really didn't become big until the 19th century. So that's a little bit more accurate, but it's still not really true. And so if you actually study the history of Christian theology and look at what Christians have thought throughout the past 2,000 years about, their views on eschatology, their understanding of Revelation, and so on, you will know that there is at least 2 centuries, the 2nd and 3rd centuries, so the centuries right after the death of the apostles and the Bible's done being written and all that, where almost everyone, at least from my studies, I don't want to overstate my case, but from what I've read, from what I've studied, it seems like almost everyone, obviously this is based on the writings of Christians from back then that we can still access today, that has survived the past 2,000 years of history. And I'm sure first of all, most of what people believe did not get written down because it's mainly an oral culture, not a culture of people writing things down. And obviously there's lots of stuff that did get written down that didn't survive, for us to be able to read and access today. But based on what we can read and access today from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of what Christians wrote, almost everyone sees Revelation as a book about the future, and their view of eschatology, the study of last things, is what that word means, eschatology, end times Bible prophecy, the study of last things. They view that as something to be fulfilled in the future, not as something that got fulfilled in their past. And so if you read Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Polycarp, Hippolytus, Victorinus, Tertullian, all these different people and other people, Methodius, there's a whole bunch of people. I think Clement of Rome as well. So a lot of these people, all these people I just named, other people, if you read what they wrote about this, read their views, they believed in a future rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Just like what dispensationalists and other futurists today believe, that there's going to be a 3rd temple. There will be a temple in Jerusalem that's going to be rebuilt. That is exactly what Irenaeus and these other people back then believed. They believed there's going to be a 3rd temple, rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, that the Antichrist, the beast, the man of sin, the son of perdition, he's going to come and commit the abomination of desolation in that temple, just like Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And the tribulation and the great tribulation that's a part of, that the book of Revelation describes, they believed that stuff was still in the future, that had not already been fulfilled in the 1st century, like what Michael Jones and Bart Ehrman are about to talk about. And that is 2 full centuries where that was the majority view. Pretty much everyone you read giving their views on prophecy, giving their views on Revelation, those are the views you're going to read. And that is standard premillennialism, standard futurist prophecy today. And some amillennialists that are futurists believe that as well. And so just like what you'll find your average, basically dispensationalist believing today about a future temple, the Antichrist is going to show up, he's going to go in the temple, he's going to commit the abomination of desolation, there's going to be this tribulation happening all over the world. That is what they believed back then for 2 centuries. That was the majority view of Christians, at least based on the writings that we can still access today. And so to sit there and say, oh, basically no one, there was occasionally somebody throughout history that believed that kind of thing, but basically no one believed that until the 19th century. That is a completely dishonest misrepresentation of history when you have literally 2 full centuries, the 2 earliest centuries in Christian history, obviously since the death of the apostles and the Bible is done being written, the 2nd century and 3rd century, the 2 earliest centuries since the apostles that we have in Christian history, and this is the dominant view. Does that count for nothing? How can you just dismiss that, ignore that, and say, nope, that didn't happen? It's just almost no one believed that till the 19th century. That is a load of garbage. Most Christians for those 2 centuries believe that, and you can't just dismiss that and act like those Christians didn't exist and that it's not until the 19th century that you see. Yeah, in the 19th century there was a resurgence, and it has become the majority view again. I mean, at least amongst Protestants or something. But yeah, to just dismiss those 2 early centuries where that was the majority view is ridiculous, and he's obviously just misrepresenting history here to make it look like, haha, no Christians have ever believed this until the fundamentalists rised up in the 19th century, and of course everyone knows fundamentalists are so stupid, so we can just dismiss this view. No, if you're going to dismiss that and act like only stupid fundamentalist type people believe that, then you're going to have to dismiss Irenaeus and all these other people. And so it's a complete misrepresentation of history. So that's basically what I have to say about that. We'll just move on.
In your view, I know that there are many different scholarly views about what this book is doing. What is your view on what is going on here, the cultural context? Just briefly give us your little pitch about what the book is about.
The context, I think, is pretty clear. This was written sometime near the end of the 1st century by somebody who was living in 1st century Roman Empire. He's actually addressing his book to 7 churches, and what scholars generally think, they disagree, as you say, they disagree on ways to interpret it, but they all, historical scholars all agree that when John, the guy's name was John, when John wrote to these 7 churches, he expected them to understand what he was talking about. He was not talking about the 21st century. He was talking about them and he's writing for them. And so my view of Revelation has changed radically.
All right, let me address that right there, because he's saying, oh, well, because, and notice he gave what's considered the late date of Revelation. It was written towards the end of the 1st century. And this is because of the historical witness about John writing this towards the end of the reign of the Emperor Domitian, and Irenaeus and Eusebius, and there's a bunch of people in history that talk about this, that towards the end of that guy's reign is when the Apostle John was exiled to the island of Patmos and wrote the book of Revelation. And so they think it was 95 to 96 AD, because that's, in 96 is when his reign ended. And so he's giving the standard view. This is the late date view, but then he's going to give a basically preterist interpretation that the events are about what's called the Jewish War, where the Romans are fighting the Jews and invade Jerusalem and end up conquering the city of Jerusalem, destroying the temple. And all this takes place between 66 and 70 AD, several decades before John actually wrote the book of Revelation. And that doesn't make any sense. Obviously, from a Christian perspective, you can't combine those 2 things, or at least if you can, you have to explain it to me. I do not understand how you could combine those 2 things in a reasonable way, because the book of Revelation claims to be a prophecy. So how could John be writing a prophecy of events that already happened decades ago? That doesn't make any sense to me. Now, obviously, Ehrman doesn't care about this because he's an atheist. And once again, for him, this is just another great argument against the book of Revelation being an authentic, legitimate prophetic book. If he accepts the late date, which of course everyone should, because that's where the evidence is, and I'll talk about that more in a later video. If he accepts the late date, but then combines that with a preterist kind of interpretation that it's about events that happened decades ago, that means it's not an authentic prophetic book. It's just basically a history book that somebody's writing cryptically with a bunch of symbols. And so it's completely useless as a work of prophecy, which of course is how he's going to interpret it as an atheist. But that means that every Christian's view of Revelation is wrong, because every Christian views Revelation as a book of prophecy. You see what I'm saying? Once again, his interpretation of Revelation is something that is directly antithetical to how every kind of Christian, no matter your interpretation, views the book of Revelation, because what he's trying to do, because what Bart Ehrman is pretty much always trying to do, is attack the Bible and undermine people's faith in the Bible. And so I don't know why a Christian apologist would bring him on to talk about this. But another thing I want to address here is that he talked about, oh, well, John was writing this in the Roman Empire. And so he's addressing these 7 churches, of course, in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, and he's addressing these churches. So he expects them to know what he's talking about. He's talking about stuff going on back in their day in the 1st century there in the Roman Empire. And so it's not talking about events happening in the 21st century. And Michael Jones laughs, oh, yes, of course, this is so ridiculous. Of course, it's not talking about the future. Folks, how stupid is that? if you take that and apply it consistently to prophetic books of the Bible, you've now destroyed every prophetic book of the Bible, basically. Because yeah, Daniel is addressing people in his day in the Babylonian exile. But guess what? He also talks about the Messiah. Guess what? He also talks about the future read the end of Daniel in Daniel 12, where he's talking about the future resurrection, and he talks about people coming up out of the graves and all that. Folks, that still hasn't happened yet. So we're now thousands of years removed from stuff that Daniel prophesies in the book of Daniel. So how you can't just sit there and say, oh, but wasn't Daniel addressing his contemporary audience? Of course he was. But he's also talking about stuff that still hasn't happened yet, that will happen in the much distant future from when Daniel wrote that. So it's not ridiculous. It's not crazy to say, yeah, of course, John is writing the book of Revelation to contemporary people, the people in those churches that he expects them to read and understand what he's talking about, but he's also talking about events that won't be fulfilled until the distant future. That's what Daniel did. That is what Isaiah did. Isaiah is talking about the new heavens and new earth. Folks, are we on the new heavens and new earth yet? Or is that something that's still going to happen in the future after Jesus comes back? Because according to Bart Ehrman, if any prophet talks about something and he's addressing his peers, people that are alive at the same time as him, then he's not allowed to talk about events in the distant future. That means when Isaiah talks about the new heavens and the new earth and the new earth must have happened back then during Isaiah's lifetime. Well, obviously, that's stupid. Obviously, no one believes that. We all understand the new heavens and the new earth are future. That is when Christ comes back. He lifts the curse of sin from the earth and deals with all of that. That is when the new heavens and the new earth get established. They didn't get established back in Isaiah's day just because he talks about it. He's talking about the distant future. Well, the same thing applies to the book of Revelation. Yes, he is addressing 7 churches in his time, but he's also prophesying about events that will happen in the future because they still haven't even happened yet as of now. So it's just wrong and stupid to say, well, because he's addressing his contemporary people, he can't be talking about future events. No, that doesn't make any sense. You can't apply that thinking to any prophetic book of the Bible. And if you look at Revelation in detail, it talks about, like in the first chapter, John talks about how I believe it's Jesus himself addressing John, saying to write the things you have seen, the things which now are, and the things which are to come hereafter, as I think is how he phrases it. So you have the things that you've seen, the things that now are, and the things that are come hereafter. And then you see John in the next 2 chapters, chapters 2 and 3, is when he's specifically addressing the 7 churches and their specific issues happening at all those different churches. Then what happens when you start Revelation chapter 4? Folks, open it up and read it. He gets summoned up to heaven in the spirit, and it says that when he's taken up there, and I think it talks about an angel showing him the things that must be hereafter. So that is when you have a transition to where he's moving away from the things that now are, where he's addressing the 7 churches and the issues that they were dealing with at that time, and then transitions to talk about the things that must happen hereafter. And he doesn't specify like really soon hereafter or in the distant future hereafter. It doesn't specify, but it says that's when the book of Revelation starts addressing the things that must happen hereafter. So you see a clear transition. So yes, chapters 2 and 3, he's addressing the churches, dealing with stuff happening for them in their time. But then after that, he's addressing stuff that is going to happen in the future. And there's no problem with thinking that that is in the distant future and that stuff hasn't even happened yet. And so Bart Ehrman is just wrong to sit there and say, oh, well, he's addressing churches from his day. Therefore, the whole book of Revelation is about stuff that was happening back then with those specific churches. That's stupid and absurd. Anyone just reading the book of Revelation can figure out that that's not what it's talking about. But again, does Michael Jones challenge it? No, he just sits there and laughs and nods. Oh, yes, of course, futurism is so stupid. Okay, let's see what else he has to say.
Over the last 3 or 4 years, I used to teach a fairly standard liberal Christian view of this book, which is that it was written in order to provide hope for those who are suffering persecution. And so it was a book of hope. And I have very much changed my view of that. It is a book of hope for those very few Christians in the world who agreed with John. Everyone else is going to be sent to burn in the lake of burning sulfur, everyone who's ever lived. And God's going to destroy this planet, and he's going to inflict horrible misery on the vast majority of the population. So I guess it's a book of hope for people who get through it okay, who have the right beliefs, but for everyone else, it's horrible. And so my book is in part,
and he's correct about that,
dealing with what D.H. Lawrence called the dark side of Christianity. D.H. Lawrence, the novelist, D.H. Lawrence wrote all those racy novels. His last book was on the book of Revelation, and he did not like it.
Yeah, I honestly can't wait to read it. I'm very interested to see your view, because I try to take more of what you were talking about, your older view. So I'd be very interested to see the perspective and see that challenge and whatnot. So let's get into it a little bit more. What is the mark of the beast in your view, and why is it a computer chip on your forehead?
It is not a computer chip on your forehead. I know. There you go. It's like, oh my God, it used to be credit cards. Oh my God, credit card. Now it's like, oh, whatever. So in Revelation, there are some people who are chosen by God who receive his mark on them, and everybody else gets the mark of God's enemy, the beast. And it's just some kind of tattoo that people get. And if you don't have the tattoo, you're not allowed to buy anything like food. And so Christians are being persecuted. The beast himself, this might be one of your next questions, but it's 666. Is that one of your questions?
Yeah, let's talk just your view about this, because I know this is as you said, like John knew what he was writing, and he thought the church would understand. We're still trying to figure that out. So
So again, they're talking about this like, oh, this is so funny and ridiculous that people think that this is about, oh, a computer chip or something to do with credit cards. Or he just explained it, and you'll see this if you read Revelation 13, where it talks about the mark of the beast, and it says that you have to take the mark in order to buy or sell. So if this is a future prophecy that has not been fulfilled yet, and it clearly states that you have to take this mark, whatever it is, I'm not saying I know what it is. I'm not saying it's for sure some kind of computer chip that the government's going to force you to take, and then you can't, that as a part of some kind of credit system, and you have to take it in order to use that to buy and sell things. So if you don't take the mark of the beast, you'll be left out of their financial. I'm not saying we can know for sure right now what it is, but what it clearly describes it as something that you take in order to buy or sell. So if it is the case that this is prophecy that has not yet been fulfilled, why is it so crazy or ridiculous? Ha 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 ha! They're so crazy. They said that that credit cards were going to be the mark of the beast. Well, I mean, it's silly because obviously a credit card is not embedded in your right hand or in your forehead. But the only reason this seems silly to them is because they're just dismissing the idea of a futurist reading of this prophecy. Whereas if it's even possible that the futurist reading is true, then it has to be something like that. It has to be, I'm not saying that we know what it is, but the idea of getting a microchip in your hand or forehead to participate in the government's financial system, and that you'll be left out of that financial system if you don't take that, that's not a crazy interpretation at all if you think this is something that is still to be fulfilled in the future. Because it's straight, Bart Ehrman, you just heard Bart Ehrman himself describe it as this is something that you have to get in order to buy or sell, because that's what the Bible says. So I don't really see what is so funny about this to Michael Jones.
These mysteries are scholars are pretty sure about, and others they debate about. The 666 thing is pretty clear to most scholars. It's a way of indicating the numerical value of the enemy's name. The enemy is called a beast, and the beast, like in other books of the Bible, the book of Daniel, other books, Revelation, the beast represents both a kingdom and an individual, just as in Daniel chapter 7, it's the same thing. So the beast is both a kingdom and an individual, and it's quite clear who the kingdom is. It's the enemy of the Christians in John's day that has shed the blood of the Christians, and that is wealthy, and that is exploiting economically the rest of it. It's Rome. It's the Roman Empire. 666, the angel tells John that that's the number of a man. And so the first emperor to persecute Christians was Nero, who certainly shed Christian blood. And the number of a man means you take the letters of his name and you add them up. In ancient alphabets, in ancient languages like Greek and Hebrew, you didn't have a separate alphabet and a separate numerical system the way we do. We use a Latin or Roman alphabet. We use Arabic numerals. They use their own alphabet for the numerals. And so if you spell Caesar Nero, Emperor Nero, spell Caesar Nero in Hebrew letters, the letters add up to 666.
So pretty straightforward. I mean, yeah, that's one thing about the book scholars are pretty sure on, and yet so many laymen today think it's something else entirely.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so this is the reason that I wanted to review this video. This is an amazingly dishonest explanation for Bart Ehrman, because there's no way that he doesn't know that what he just said is not really accurate, because he's either amazingly ignorant and has not actually studied this in detail at all, which I highly doubt, because he is a he is a scholar. I expect him to know what he's talking about. In which case, he must be knowingly misleading people. And I expect Michael Jones has no idea what's going on, because he's just eating up with fork and spoon everything Bart Ehrman is saying. I don't know to what extent he's actually studied any of this, but he's all too happy to just accept whatever Bart Ehrman says because he's giving him the kind of view that he wants, because apparently Michael Jones just really hates futurism for whatever reason. And so, but you notice what Bart Ehrman just got done said. First of all, it's this is the scholarly view, as if all scholars disagree on this. I mean, he said, well, most scholars agree on this, but you can find people that like preterists like James Jordan, who does not agree with this. He said that 666 has nothing to do with Nero. And then there's another guy, I believe his name is Simon Keistemaker. It's like Keistemaker. Keistemaker, I think is how it's pronounced. I'm not sure. But he takes an idealist interpretation. We're not going to talk about what that is. But so he's not a futurist or dispensationalist kind of thing that these people are mocking. He takes an idealist interpretation, and he likewise explains in his commentary why 666 is almost certainly not referring to Nero. And I'm going to explain some of that here in a second. But I want to again just emphasize, Bart Ehrman has already explained that he believes that the Book of Revelation was written, like I said, that late date in the 90s under the reign of Emperor Domitian. And now he goes back and says, oh, well, 666 is referring to Nero. Again, this is not an interpretation of Revelation that makes any sense for Christians to take, because Revelation is a prophecy, not a history book. So it doesn't make any sense to say, yeah, Revelation was written in the 90s, but it's prophesying about events that happened decades earlier. That doesn't make any sense. And yet Michael Jones, I don't know, this doesn't seem to be clicking with him for some reason. He doesn't say anything about this, connect the dots. It doesn't make any sense to say Revelation was written decades after the events it's supposedly prophesying about. This is why preterists all argue that for an early date of Revelation being written under, in the reign of Nero, when this stuff is going on, although there's very, very good reasons to think that that's not true, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But anyway, so if you're a preterist and you believe that 666 is referring to Nero, you have to believe in this early date, because that's the only way it makes any sense. But again, so what we're getting from Bart Ehrman doesn't make any sense. And it is not something that Christians can believe. Again, the reason he's arguing this is specifically to undermine your faith. Oh yeah, we believe that it was written later, but it's talking about events in the past. That completely undermines Christian faith in the Book of Revelation, because that means Revelation is not a prophecy. That's why he is arguing this way. But let's look into the details of 666. He says, oh yeah, if you just add up the letters to the name Nero Caesar in Hebrew, it just adds up to 666. So it's really straightforward. And then Michael just, oh yes, it's very straightforward. Yeah, it's really straightforward lie, because it's not true. And this is the typical the way the preterists would typically argue this. They would just straight up lie about this and say, yep, exactly what Bart Ehrman just said. You take the Hebrew letters of his name, add them up, equals 666. Folks, first of all, think about this. Why would you be adding up, like he said, if you didn't understand this, they don't have numbers, they don't have numerals the way we do to represent numbers. The different letters have different numerical values, and you add up the letter. You do math with the letters. You add up the letters to get a total, because the letters have different values in Hebrew and in Greek. But think about this. John wrote his book in Greek. He's writing to Hellenistic, Greek-speaking churches in Rome. These are not Hebrew-speaking people. Why would you add up the letters of Nero's name in Hebrew instead of in Greek? The only argument they can really give is because his name in Greek doesn't add up to 666, so you have to do it in Hebrew. But notice how that's begging the question. That is a circular argument, because you're just assuming it has to be referring to Nero. Therefore, we have to add it up in Greek or we have to add it up in Hebrew instead of in Greek. But it makes more sense to add it up in Greek instead of in Hebrew. So you're trying to overcome that hurdle by making a circular argument. Well, but his name doesn't add up to 666 in Greek, so we have to go to Hebrew. You're assuming your conclusion. It's a circular argument to argue that way. And so one thing that scholars will argue, of course, Bart Ehrman doesn't bother giving any of these arguments because Michael Jones doesn't push back in any of his questions. But one of the arguments that they will give is that, well, John does say stuff in Revelation in Hebrew, therefore we can assume that his audience knows Hebrew. Folks, you cannot assume that. He literally gives like 2 different Hebrew words in the book of Revelation. One of them, he also gives the Greek word. I believe there's only one Hebrew word that John gives in the book of Revelation that he leaves untranslated. So supposedly, because he uses, and it's the word Armageddon, because that's a Hebrew word apparently. So because John uses the Hebrew word Armageddon, this one word, therefore we can safely assume that all of his Greek-speaking Christian churches he's writing to are apparently fluent in Hebrew, and they're going to know that they need to add up the name Nero Caesar in Hebrew to get to the number 666. That's a stupid argument, and that's why Bart Ehrman doesn't even bother making that argument, because it doesn't make any sense. So right off the bat here, it doesn't make any sense to add up here Nero's name in Hebrew. There's no reason to assume that John's audience can even read Hebrew, and so this argument can't even get off the ground because that doesn't even make any sense. But then you have, when you do try to add up his name in Hebrew, it doesn't add up to 666, folks. It adds up to 616. So it doesn't even add up to the actual number of the beast that John gives us in Revelation 13. So what they have to do is add an extra Hebrew letter, the letter nun. So they end up spelling it out as Neron Caesar, because they add the letter nun to the end of Nero, Neron Caesar. But then that doesn't add up to 666 either. It adds up to 676. So then what do they have to do? Well, when you were to transliterate Greek into Hebrew, you would spell out Caesar with the Hebrew letter Yod. And so what they have to do is they have to say, well, let's take that letter out of the name Caesar, because Yod has a value of 10. So if they take out the letter Yod, well, there you go. It went from 676 to 666, the number that we're trying to get to. But again, notice how all of this is circular argument. Why would you add the letter nun to Nero's name? The only real reason they have for doing that is because they have to. It's a circular argument. Why take the letter Yod out of the name Caesar? Again, the only real reason they have for doing that is a circular argument. Well, we have to. We have to add a letter here, take away a letter over here, just to make his name add up to 666, because otherwise it will not add up to that number. But again, this is a circular argument. Why do you have to monkey around with how his name is spelled to get it to add up? Well, you're just assuming the conclusion and arguing towards that conclusion in this circular way of, well, we know it has to mean Nero. 666 has to be referring to Nero. Therefore, we're going to go into whatever language we have to, spell his name however we have to get it to add up to 666, and boom, there we go. Then we prove that 666 is talking about Nero. That doesn't prove anything, because all of your evidence is just circular. The whole thing is a stupid circular argument. And even preterist scholars like Ken Gentry, who somehow believe this, even Ken Gentry will admit that this is an uncommon way to spell Nero's name. So there's no good reason to spell his name that way, except that you have to make it add up to 666. But again, that's just a circular argument. You're just assuming your conclusion and arguing however you need to in order to get it there, and spelling his name in a peculiar way in order to get the number that you wanted to get to. So when he sits there and says, so that's what the evidence actually is, folks. They have to spell it in Hebrew instead of Greek, even though there's no good reason to. There's no good reason to. He just made all this big stuff about how, oh, well, it has to make sense with the original audience that John's writing to, but there's no reason to think John's audience speaks Hebrew. And then you have to monkey around with his name, spell his name in a very particular way to make it add up to that. They're just forcing the evidence to fit the conclusion that they already have. But notice Bart Ehrman didn't bother to tell you any of that. He straight up lies and says, if you just take Nero Caesar in Hebrew and add it up, it just adds up to 666. And Michael Jones, who has no idea clearly what any of this evidence is, just sits there and goes, oh yes, that's very straightforward. Yeah, it's straightforward if you just believe a lie, I guess, but that's not what the actual evidence is. So no, none of this is straightforward. They're monkeying around with how you spell his name. It's all just a big circular argument. It's all begging the question fallacy. But yeah, that's the nonsense we get from Bart Ehrman. This is what happens when you invite this atheist scholar onto your channel to lie to your followers, apparently. And Michael Jones clearly doesn't know any of this evidence, doesn't provide any pushback, just believes whatever Bart Ehrman says and goes, oh yes, oh, that's so straightforward. And notice their attitude is, the only reason people disagree with this is because they're a bunch of ignorant fundamentalists who they just don't know this evidence. It's completely ridiculous.
Oh no, I'm saying it was Gorbachev, and now it's obviously Putin. And it's like, take your pick, whoever's the bad guy at the time. Throughout the Reformation, of course, they said it's the Pope. The Protestants said it's the Pope, and still people say things like that. But yeah, it's got to fit in its own context. And once you do, it's just it lightens it up. You start understanding. Oh my God, that's what that's about.
So then let's talk about the other side, because it talks about the 144,000 asylum. And this is like a big thing for Jehovah's Witnesses. They thought they were able to identify that exact number.
Okay, well, that's basically all I have to say, because they're going to talk about the 144,000 and what they think that's about, and I don't really have a strong opinion on that one way or the other, so I'm not even going to really comment on that. And they just basically talk about that and talk about how, I think then they talk about how it'll be like another year until his book actually gets published, and then they talk some more about how he's got an upcoming debate with Mike Licona on the resurrection. It's going to be this epic 7-hour debate and whatever. So that's basically what I had to say about this. To just summarize everything we've gone over, Michael Jones, Christian apologist, brings on literally the most notorious living atheist scholar of the New Testament to talk about the book of Revelation, to supposedly explain what the book of Revelation is actually talking about, and to reveal the secrets of the book of Revelation. Sets him up with a question about how did Revelation get into the canon, lets him attack the book of Revelation left and right, how it shouldn't really be in the New Testament, how the Apostle John didn't write it, doesn't push back at all, doesn't ask him to provide any evidence for any of the claims that he's making. No iron sharpening iron here. Let me challenge you to see what the evidence is for your position and how it responds to this challenge. No, just totally go unchallenged. Then talks to him about the prophecy and his view on when it was written and so on. And like I said, the big lie that I wanted to expose was this idea that 666 is referring to Nero. There is no good reason to think that 666 is referring to Nero. As I explained, the evidence, as Bart Ehrman explained it, is just a straight up lie. It is not the case that in Hebrew, Nero Caesar just adds right up to 666 and there's no problem and it's straightforward. No, that is not the case at all. If you actually read other scholars talking about this, and again, even non-futurist premillennialists, people like James Jordan and Simon Keistmaker, I hope I pronounced his name right, it might be different than that. They also explain this, and they are not convinced by the evidence, and they say that no, 666 has nothing to do with Nero, and so it's not just premillennialists and futurists that would claim that, and that's because the evidence for that is very weak and very bad, and the only reason people are convinced by it is because they hear presentations like this from Bart Ehrman and from other preterists that will like Steve Gregg and David Chilton and people like that will present this evidence in a way that is basically lying to people, because they will do what Bart Ehrman just did and act like, oh yeah, it's straightforward and simple. You just add up the letters and Nero's name, it equals 666. See, how could you possibly deny this when that's not the evidence at all? And so that's basically it. That's what I wanted to say in response to this video. And it just, again, as I've been saying, it just kind of amazes me that this Christian apologist brings this guy on to say all this stuff about the book of Revelation, doesn't challenge him on any of these things. He clearly wants to believe what Bart Ehrman has to say about it, because he likes 666, that's about Nero, because he just hates futurism for whatever reason. And so he just is basically is just ready and willing to just believe whatever Bart Ehrman tells him, even though there's no good evidence for anything Bart Ehrman is saying. And so, yeah, that's basically what I had to say in response to this video. And then at the end of this video, he literally promotes the book and is like telling people, oh, I can't wait to buy this book and read this book. And it's basically almost like endorsing this book and telling people to read this book, when everything we've seen so far from Bart Ehrman has been, I mean, everything in this video that he's been talking about is stuff that is either it's not true or it's not compatible with Christian theology. And so it doesn't really make any sense to promote this book to your Christian audience. But yeah, that's basically what I have to say in response to this video. And like I said, I will make another video later talking about the date of when the book of Revelation was written, because I think pretty much all the evidence is on the side of the book of Revelation being written, as Bart Ehrman says, the one thing Bart Ehrman says is actually right, that it was written in like 95 or 96, which means preterism cannot be true. But we'll talk about that more in a later video. So I hope everyone enjoyed this and learned something, and learned why you absolutely cannot take Bart Ehrman at his word. You have to look at the evidence and see if what he's talking about makes any sense. But yep, I hope everyone learned something and enjoyed watching my review of Michael Jones interviewing Bart Ehrman. And so God bless you. Have a good day.